Here with Emil Kierkegaard. How are you doing today, Emil?
I'm pretty good. I've been looking forward to this a little bit, just preparing some notes for this.
Cool. Yeah, I had some questions for you. I've been working through, broadly speaking, mental illness, obesity, political affinity, intelligence, psychometrics as a layperson, as an amateur, someone who doesn't have a scientific or psychological background, and trying to critically look through what's available. You have uh, published research that I think is a critical part of the conversation if people want to understand these topics. We can agree or disagree on certain conclusions or interpretations or something, but you're doing the work to attempt to answer these questions. And one of the questions I had when I was looking through your studies, and this is something that I've been asking for a long time, because the correlation between, for example, narcissistic personality traits and extreme liberal political self-identification, that correlation has been around for a while now. I don't know who first discovered it, but so one of the questions I would have is, how much are we differentiating and how much can we rely upon self-reported diagnostics? Because, for example, one of the ideas I had was, well, maybe if a conservative is a narcissist, they just will never go to therapy. They'll never get diagnosed. They'll always sort of, figure out a way around that. And then someone asks, are you a narcissist? No, of course I'm not. Whereas a liberal will be like, oh, I should trust the experts. Something's wrong with me. TikTok's telling me to go to therapy. And then they're going to be in an environment where they're more likely to be diagnosed, even if the underlying behavior is exactly the same. So how do we kind of account for it? Is there a bias there? Is the way there to test for that sort of bias?
Yeah, so it's a difficult topic. Almost all data out there concerns self-report, for the obvious logistic reason that getting some other kind of data is difficult. Surveys, you can just ask people lots of questions, but you can kind of indirectly get, well, not objective data, but other data. So in typical questionnaires used for research, like depression or whatever, you have a bunch of questions like, in the last 2 weeks, have you been feeling blue, or have you had trouble sleeping, feeling stressed? These kind of questions are typical, right? So these are used in these mental health screeners. In some surveys, they instead ask people, has a mental health professional ever diagnosed you with XYZ? So insofar as people can honestly report whether some mental health professional has given them an actual diagnosis of something, it is giving you a different kind of data, right? It's not just asking about symptoms, it's asking about diagnosis, which necessarily must come from a third party, right? The question that you're really asking about from a statistical perspective is measurement invariance. When we have all these symptom scales, or we have the diagnostic data, do conservatives, compared to liberals in the US or somewhere else, do they seek out mental health at a different threshold, right? You can kind of think of having a kind of threshold. How sick do you have to be to go to a doctor? Whether it's a mental health doctor or a regular doctor, if you keep coughing after flu for 3 weeks, maybe it's not the flu, right? And different people have different thresholds, also with normal doctors, right? If you check medical literature, you'll find that men, for instance, are much more reluctant to seek out doctors compared to women. So women often go to the doctors with what men would consider to be relatively minor things, but women have a different threshold, right? So is the same thing possible in terms of psychiatry? And yes, of course, it is possible. And what you would have to do is get some data, whether you're doing symptoms or diagnosis or some kind of mixed, and you would check whether the data, if you use the data as a test, and you say this test measures depression, or it measures anxiety, or something else, does the test work the same? Like, are the statistical properties of this test the same across groups? If it is, then it's said to be measurement invariant, as in the properties of the test don't vary, they're invariant. And if it varies, then it's said to be non-invariant, which is a bit odd. Measurement variance, I guess, sound too strange, so it's double negative. There is some research on this, but I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but there is some research. There was a large study, I think, by some American researchers. They were interested in this question, not just with regards to mental health, but with regards to all sorts of things like optimism or political agency or whatever, all these kind of surveys that they tend to give to college students and so on, to see how liberals are different from conservatives, like in psychological terms. And so they ran this measurement invariance testing for all these like 15 or so different kinds of scales, various scales for measuring psychological traits. And in general, they didn't find much bias. So it seems that in general, the way that liberals and conservative answer survey data is quite similar, even though they have different scores, right? So they also measured like normal personality variation, like conscientiousness and these sorts of things, big five stuff. They didn't find much difference, but their study was not focused on mental health. They had a few scales, but not it wasn't the focus, right? I recently did a reanalysis of Finnish data. So there was a Finnish researcher, I think his name is Laktonen, or Finnish names are a bit difficult. He had a large sample, 5,000 plus people. And these were general population and some university samples. And he gave them two of these self-report scales, one for depression and one for anxiety. Each of these have 10, 15 questions, something like this. And he just calculated the score. But because the data was public, I downloaded the data and I fit these statistical models to check whether he also had political questions, right? I checked whether the measurement properties were invariant across the political spectrum, and I didn't find any evidence of bias. But I did find another interesting finding, which was that the correlation between he had a kind of wokeness scale, but it will be just kind of a left-right scale. The correlation with anxiety and leftism in Finland in the general population is about 0.4. And the depression one is only 0.2. There's a very large difference. It's twice as strong. And because the sample size is so large, we can rule out any sampling error. This is not a coincidence. So it seems that even if you just think of mental illness as a kind of overall like construct, the P factor or some of these broader concepts, it's quite clear that some even strong anxiety and depression are very strongly correlated. They're in the same subcluster. But even these two show different relations with politics in this sample. And there was no. I also tried bias the other way. It could be that maybe people who are more anxious fill out political surveys differently, right? There could be bias in two directions. Maybe the political scale doesn't work across the mental health spectrum instead of the other way around. But I didn't find any evidence of this either. But to answer your questions about the diagnosis or seeing a therapist and this sort of thing, these data sets did not ask whether someone was seeing a therapist or had a diagnosis. So they can't actually answer the question you specifically had, like whether this threshold might be different. I suspect you're right that in kind of prominent left-wing culture, there's kind of a victim points on the intersectionality scale. If you have more diagnosis of this or that, is kind of seen as a way to prop yourself up. And so it makes sense if these people were more likely to seek out therapy or some other mental health professional, even if they're just as sad as a conservative. A conservative, I imagine, like a Trump-loving Christian conservative from Oklahoma or something, they might be a bit sad, and then they talk to their spouse and they say, let's go to church and work it out. And so maybe they do that for some months, and their depression kind of goes away. Depression tends to come and go, right? If you know some people with major depression. So I imagine you would get results like this, but as far as I know, There's no study that has looked into that particular question about the threshold.
Yeah, specifically regarding religion. So, one of the questions I'm trying to figure out and understand is when we talk about liberals having worse mental health, is that because liberal ideology is, messing with people's minds and making them mentally ill? Is that because mentally ill people are attracted to liberalism? Or is there some kind of comorbidity, mutational load where these spiteful mutants are just biologically deranged and that causes their mental illness, but then at the same time it causes them to believe crazy things and to resent healthy people? I think that I've heard Edward Dutton say things like that at times. So and maybe his view has evolved since I last checked in on him, but I guess looking at that view as a whole, I then have to ask, well, what's going on with conservatives? And like you said, if we look at religious people and they're going to church every single week, I guess the question there is I'm trying to isolate not just what is kind of an expressed mental illness in terms of somebody's outward behaviors like suicide attempts, criminal activity, addictive behaviors, etc. But I'm looking at kind of how much coping mechanisms do they need in their life to behave normally and to behave functionally. And if you have a liberal who says, well, if I don't take my meds every week, and if I don't go to therapy and every week, and I don't do all this, otherwise I can't function. Well, clearly, like, this is a psychologically dependent person. This is not we would not say they have a lot of psychological strength. By the same token, however, somebody who goes to church every week and is part of all of these counseling and religious things that we wouldn't consider part of, mental health professionals, then, the question becomes to me, is really the one set so much more mentally healthy than the other set? I would kind of submit that the most mentally healthy person is the person when you strip them from all therapy, all church, all sort of supportive structures, that they're able to perform at the best. Now, what does that mean? How do we measure that exactly? It's almost impossible, right? Because, for instance, with suicide, how do you take people who have committed suicide and then kind of retroactively go back and figure out, okay, well, what did you vote in the last election? It's very hard data to access.
I imagine you could do this with the US election, since every, whatever, 4 years or so, Americans have another election. Sometimes the power swaps, right? Whether Biden took the power from Trump, now Trump takes it back from Biden. I guess Biden could run again. So theoretically, you could look across counties in the US, of which there are some 3,000 something, and you could check the suicide rates to see if these spike in the losers camp. I don't know if this has been done, but I imagine that this might have been done.
It actually has been.
It sounds like it has been done, yeah?
Yeah, that has been done.
It probably works, no?
So yeah, that's one way to approach it. The other way to so I actually didn't kind of prepare this question, but it's one that I still want to get your thoughts on, which is, as you alluded to, there's a tendency to think of mental illness as a linear, one-dimensional quantity, that you could have zero mental illness or you could have 100 mental illness and shades in between. But actually, we should view this as kind of a multi-dimensional factor with maybe some kind of correlation, but like anxiety and depression are pretty closely correlated. But on the other hand, something where maybe I disagree with the psychological establishment, or there's some kind of disagreement about definitions here, is I don't consider obesity to be a physical illness like COVID, the flu, having a broken arm, those sorts of things where there's an external factor which has imposed itself on a person, or you have multiple sclerosis or something you're born with. Mm-hmm. Obviously, people have a predilection toward obesity, but I don't. And you can say, well, it's the way that you carry fat in the body, or your estrogen production, or something like that. But
what about the starvation then?
Obviously, if you're, there are countries in Africa where the obesity rate is very low. and the starvation rate is relatively high. But when we're talking about Western democracies, first world countries, to the extent that people are obese, it is not a physical imposition from the outside. It is basically habitual behavior involving dietary choice, calories in, calories out. Sure, there's some, special dietary advice about, well, if you eat 1 pound of chicken versus 1 pound of Cheetos and Cheez-Its and so on, you're going to get different fat content as a result, or BMI. But ultimately, people make choices. And when someone is morbidly obese, that's not just someone made one wrong choice one day out of the year. It's someone made a very bad choice every day for years and years and years to end up that way. Especially with childhood obesity, I don't think of that at all as a poor choice on the child. I think of that as basically the parents having a form of mental illness in terms of neglect, low empathy, inability to, see cause and effect. Hey, I'm giving my kid all these donuts and they're getting fat. And I think, obviously mental illness is heritable. So if we're detecting a population with a lot of childhood obesity, the parents are likely mentally ill. The kids are probably mentally ill. It's probably, so all of that is to say, conservatives have a higher rate of obesity. They have a higher rate of childhood obesity. And this indicates to me that conservatives have a higher rate of mental illness on this axis. Now, liberals have a higher rate of mental illness on anxiety and depression, narcissism, and others. But so that's the way I'm starting to look at this, is not that, one side is just so much more genetically fit than the other side or something like that, but that these sides are mentally ill in very different ways. And so
Ella,
expand on that for me.
So Ella girl, the internet prostitute, I guess, she runs a lot of surveys, and in one of the surveys, she asks about politics and stuff, and she also asked about all the diagnoses. And she made this plot of which diagnoses are more common with left or right people of those who take her surveys. It's obviously not exactly a representative sample. It's whoever reads Ella girl on Twitter or whatever. Nevertheless, it is a very large sample, so it allows relatively fine-grained analysis you couldn't do with a normal survey because you just don't have enough people with rare diagnosis. As I recall, in her results, just about every diagnosis, with a very few exceptions, were more common on the left, but in very different degrees, as we talked about with the depression and anxiety, at least in the Finnish data. The only one I think that was slightly more common in the conservatives in her sample was sociopathy, or like antisocial personality, kind of like extreme callousness. And that kind of fits, because if you think of like the tough man, he's like obviously a conservative, he's like into military and this sort of thing. These people tend to be callous from a left-wing perspective, right? Most of the other ones coded for left-wingism, but in different degrees. Since you didn't give me this question, I didn't look up this one plot to memorize it exactly, but I can look it up later. But yeah, I think you're right. So you can't say, we can't talk about overall mental illness, which is basically using this proxy construct of the P factor, or the general psychopathology factor. And it works similar to in intelligence research, as if you take all diagnoses, or you take all symptoms that people can report that belong to different diagnoses. If you check all of these, how often they co-occur or their correlations, these are almost all positive. They're not all positive, but they're very close to being all positive. So it seems that there's a kind of a parsimonious model would be to say that, well, if we only want to describe things in one dimension, it's just that everything goes up and everything is worse. But in practice, of course, we know that certain symptoms and behavior patterns, they tend to go together. We talked about anxiety and depression. These two go in the internalizing cluster. There's the externalizing stuff, which like is actually acting out your issues. This results in drug abuse and violent behavior and these kind of things. And then depending on how many you keep adding, a third one is usually thought disorder, which is basically schizophrenia and bipolar, which more or less can be thought of as seeing things that aren't there or hearing things that are not there. And so bipolar people are not generally kind of in this, but when they're in the manic phase, they tend to be very similar to schizophrenics. And when they're in the depressive phase, well, then they're similar to depressives, right? So they kind of phase. And so you can, then there are some other ones that just don't fit this free cluster, which is usually autism. And so they often get put in some fourth kind of remnant category of like developmental disorders, which include autism and a few other weird things, even rare stuff. And then retardation, which is a kind of odd one because it's kind of like obesity in that there are kind of two ways to be retarded, like very low intelligence. The first way is to have something like Down syndrome. So you have a known large cause, and Down syndrome gives you like minus 50 IQ. So the average IQ of Down syndrome is like 50 or 55 or so. So some of these people can still be 100 IQ if you were so smart to begin with, but on average, it's low. Then there are some environmental factors, like if your mother was a heavy drinker during pregnancy, you get fetal alcohol syndrome. I can't recall exactly what the IQ difference is. I think it's about 20 negative points. So if you were an average person, you would go down to 80 or this sort of thing. These kind of are a bit strange, yeah. But so this is the one way to get like a very low IQ score. You have one large identifiable cause, either genetic or environmental. The other way to have very low intelligence is just to be very unlucky, because of course, intelligence varies for genetic reasons in a kind of normal distribution, just like height does. And so since we've sometimes defined mental retardation as just having below 70 IQ, which is just the same as being more than 2 standard deviations below the mean, then of course about 2% of the population will go there by this arbitrary standard. In the same way that we could say by the standards of 1950s America, anyone who is in the top two, more than 2 standard deviations above, we call obese, right? And so these kind of classifications we have for obesity, they're basically artificial, right? Why is 25 overweight and 30 is obese and 40 is morbidly obese and so on? It might as well have been some other random value, but for some reason at some point these values were picked. And I think the way you should think of those is that we know having a lot of extra weight has a bunch of negative health effects, especially if you're morbidly obese, if you're 30 plus and even 40 plus BMI. People who are just slightly overweight by the normal scale, like 25 BMI, which is like the average BMI in a European country or so, these people basically, if you look at all these meta-analysis with BMI and mortality, there's basically there's no real negative health side to BMI 25. So I think that when they chose these cutoffs, the BMI 25 cutoff was kind of meant to kick people into action, right? So when you get told by your doctor that you're overweight, this essentially is telling you should lose weight, right? It's just kind of the doctor's pseudo diagnosis that just means lose weight as a kind of recommendation, but it's not really, it's an arbitrary cutoff, right? It could have been 28 or some other way. In terms of the relation you were talking about, BMI or obesity, it doesn't correlate that very well with mental health. So you could use, if you were to go by American